Hello, and welcome to the Good City Podcast, which brings together designers, urbanists, engineers, environmental scientists, and technologists to discuss current issues facing major cities around the world. Here we explore the future of urban living and explore how cities can be transformed into vibrant, sustainable, and inclusive spaces. I'm your host, Michelle Schwerat, Director of Innovation at BDP Quadrangle and co-director of BDP Lab. Today, we're diving into India's urban future, exploring fresh thinking for how rewriting Delhi's planning code can build a thriving city. Joining us today are the brilliant minds behind the Delhi Rewriting the Code Good City paper. Kanak Tiwari, an urbanist presently leading the preparation of the vision for the capital region of Andhra Pradesh. Nilesh Rajadyuksha, an urbanist with experience delivering national policy and capacity building programs. And Manisha Bhartia and Radhika Mathur from BDP's Delhi studio. Together, they've tackled one of India's most pressing challenges: how outdated building codes are shaping cities into car-dominated, unsustainable spaces, and how a shift to form-based planning could rewrite the rules for a greener, more livable future. From the bustling streets of historic Delhi to the sprawling compounds of Gurgaon, we'll uncover how urban design can honor heritage, foster community, and pave the way for climate resilience. Get ready for an inspiring conversation about the cities we live in, the cities we love, and the cities we can co-create. Let's dive in. First of all, I wanted to let you know that I really enjoyed your paper. I find it fascinating to see how different cities approach city planning, and I love to think about what we can learn from one another's experiences, being that we're all city builders working in different parts of the world. So before we dive into the technical side of planning codes and regulations, I just want to step back for a moment. As people who have spent a lot of time thinking about cities globally, you can really feel when a city is at its turning point. There's this moment when the old rules just don't quite fit the pressure. So what about Indian cities? Why do you think now is the right time to rethink how Indian cities are planned? And what makes Delhi a focal point for this conversation? Manisha, maybe you could start us off.
Thanks, Michelle. Two things make this moment very urgent for India. It's the scale and the speed of our urbanization. In terms of scale, we are already about 40% urban, and by 2050, we are expected to add 400 odd million more residents. This is not incremental growth. This is an entire new urban India, which is being built in a single generation. And in terms of speed, the way we are building is really changing. A lot of our growth in India earlier was shaped by public investment and planned development. Now, most of it is being driven by market forces. So it's private capital, faster cycle, and a very major pressure to meet the shortage and demand that we have for all sectors: housing, commercial space, and infrastructure. So the challenge is when we are under this kind of pressure, both in terms of the scale that we have to build at and the speed, it tends to default to what we can measure and approve quickly, which are our historic codes. These are volumetric codes that measure FAR, setbacks, parking, plot coverage. The things that are harder to quantify or price into are such as environmental performance, inclusivity, safety, walkability, the quality of public space, long-term resilience. These get treated as secondary. So for me, the question isn't, do we want better cities? We all want better cities. The real question is whether our planning tools are actually capable of producing the city that we want. And, there's a line in our paper that captures it. The good urban design is being thwarted by the planning system itself. Now, Delhi matters here for two reasons. One, it is the national capital and it is enormous. It's a very fast transforming metropolis. And where we get the rules wrong, the consequences of getting the rules wrong in Delhi are visible very quickly. And the second is that it is a lighthouse city. Delhi's bylaws and planning standards have historically had an outsized influence on how other Indian cities write and enforce the regulations. So, when we talk about form based planning, it's not a theoretical preference, it's a practical question.
Thank you for that, Manisha. That really sets up the urban urgency really clearly. I mean, you're talking about bringing 400 million people to urban places. That's 10 times the size of Canada. So when I think about that, it's almost hard for me to imagine and the scale and the speed with which you need to do this. What strikes me is that it isn't really a lack of good intentions. It's more about the tools, as you've described, that we've been using to shape the cities. You spoke a little bit about volumetric codes and what they are. And I wonder if you could expand a bit more on what this actually means in practice. And then the second part of that is really about how India's volumetric planning codes have shaped the physical forms of cities and what the consequences are that we're seeing on the ground, the lived experience of the people there.
Sure. Let me unpack what we mean by volumetric codes. It sounds technical, but it's actually describing the everyday rule set behind all our formal and approved development. So, in very simple terms, a volumetric code is a planning and building regulation system, and it controls a city primarily through quantitative measures. How much can you build and where that building sits on the plot? In India, it typically works in combination with land use planning. First, at the city-wide level, land use planning will view the city as a set of different uses. You'll have residential, commercial, industrial, institutional, which are based on population estimates and mathematically derived projections of how much of each use is needed. The city is then divided into these uses, and because the system assumes incompatibility, tends to keep them separate. So you will have in most cities a default logic where residential would be separated from areas of economic productivity, such as markets and so on. Then, at the neighborhood level, this separation becomes a physical structure, zones where people largely live and zones where people work. And then the corridors that attempt to connect them. And then, thirdly, at the plot level, this is where the development controls take over. Depending on the land use assigned to the plot, you get a prescribed building envelope. You get the height, width, and length, and a set of front, rear, and side setbacks. Then you will have floor area rules, ground coverage, density norms, fire access requirements, parking standards, and often these are applied quite uniformly. This wasn't invented randomly. It came with a rationale that there was public health, access to light and ventilation, and a desire for order. But it is effectively a design by numbers template. It doesn't code for the public city, it doesn't code for the street edge, the continuity, the quality of walking networks, how the building may meet the street, whether the public realm feels safe, active, what character the parks and squares have, and whether the green blue infrastructure is integrated into the city in a way that supports climate resilience. So, what we call this in our paper is the missing middle. You can have many controls, but yet the outcomes are very repetitive. It's good for regulating floor area and setbacks, but it's not good for shaping urban quality. Now, what is really interesting is how this came about. At the time that India got independence, and we were at the cusp of planning new development, and we had to do it again a similar scale and speed. We picked up these codes from what is the DNA of the bungalow system in the colonial era, which is a building which sits in the center of a walled compound. It's set back from the street, and the boundary wall forms a real edge condition. This, over time, this logic was scaled up and standardized. And now the disconnect is that when we shift from bungalows to multi-story buildings, the relationship stays the same. Buildings such as multi-story buildings are pulled away from the street. They're surrounded by a boundary wall, and the public realm is pushed outside. And this is what has created, in a way, what I call gated islands, and what is effectively the issue with cities like Gurgaon. This has created developments that are not connected to each other. There's no concept of connected neighborhoods. So large compounds become difficult to move through on foot. Internal life is privileged over public life. And the street is just a mobility corridor where cars run. Um, Even if you were to walk on a footpath on the street, you'd basically have a boundary wall of a neighborhood, and you really wouldn't have any eyes on the street. So, the second consequence of the land use planning is because developments get internally focused. And with both the plot based division and the sort of land use based division, our roads are becoming wider and wider, and they're becoming increasingly car dominated. So, all of this results in a city that is harder to navigate without a vehicle and often reinforced with high parking norms, even in areas where mass transit exists. This all, to my mind, is really what causes the disconnect. And it leads to environmental implications, it leads to sprawling car centric cities, and it is really what plagues cities like Gurgaon. In our paper, we describe it almost as a glimpse of the future if volumetric codes continue unchecked. And the same model that Delhi had in its colonial bungalow, which then got translated to Gurgaon and is now translated all over India in all our new built, is what is dividing our cities from the people that occupy it.
I went to your paper and I looked at the diagrams that you did of Gurgaon, and I find them so interesting. It's this sort of repetitive form that I can just imagine walking down the street. You'd feel quite a disconnection walking with these sort of what you described as walls beside you. There was a piece you talk about here, and then looking at the paper, you use this term. It's like a city without a beating heart, plagued by uniformity. And to me, like I see this image, and it's perfectly clear from the image what you're describing, that if there's no consideration of the public realm, what do you have? You just have places where people live and roads where people move, and no connection between the two. So I'd say the images in your paper really describe that very well.
Yes, and unfortunately, that's what is the character of most Indian cities. And the genesis of this, I think, is in the planning codes and how they were conceived. They had a place and time for when we had a demand to build brand new cities to deal with all the refugees and house all people after partition, but they don't have a place and time right now. And we really do need to rethink, how do we integrate quality? How do we integrate urban, all the things that make good urban design, all the things that make a city worth living in, which gives it back its beating heart? How do we integrate that into the way we think about cities, the way we think about our codes, so that we don't get mistakes like Gurgaon?
Love the way you put that, bringing the heart back to the city. What I find so interesting about this is some of those qualities that you described, or some of those things that we say we want, like walkability, shade, mixed use, social life. They sound incredibly modern, right? But really, when you look at India's historic cities, they were already doing some of these things exceptionally well. You can see it clearly in the fabric of the city. And I know when I walk through historic districts of other cities around the world, including Toronto, which is a much younger city, I feel that same kind of human scale, that timelessness. What can India's historic urban forms, so places like Old Delhi, Jaipur, Ahmedabad, teach us about sustainability, inclusive urban design today? And for this one, I'm going to turn to Kanak to talk a little bit about this.
Thank you, Michelle. We have briefly mentioned this in our paper, that this is one of the greatest ironies of urban design in India. We knew it, we did it well, and then somehow we forgot how to do it. Because so much of what we are talking about is important in our lives: vibrant neighborhoods, social life, connectedness with the city, people enjoying the public realm. This used to happen. These are not new ideas. And cities that you mentioned, Old Delhi, Jaipur, Ahmedabad, and several others in India, actually were thoughtful responses to what people's lives should be. What is it that people want? They were responsive to the local climate, to the culture, and to the community. And it seems you visit these cities, and it's very clear that they were built for people, not for cars. Maybe the times were for a horse carriage or two, but to illustrate with a few examples, take Jaipur. You mentioned Jaipur. It's one of the earliest settlements that was built on a plan grid. And it was based on this ancient Indian text on town planning called Shilp Shastra. And this grid wasn't only about traffic like it is today. And, Manisha painted a dismal picture of Indian cities today. And that's true. But when you visit these older towns, you feel happy, you feel like walking. So, this grid was actually a sort of framework, a hierarchical framework built around people's daily lives. There were wider roads and with bigger buildings, and narrower ones with more community functions located alongside, residences located alongside, shaded places, colonnaded shop fronts, and small public squares called nukkars. And all of these elements encouraged interaction and social connection that we are talking about. That is the missing middle here. We are not able to do that anymore. And it seemed that the objective of the settlement design was more about creating cooler spaces, deal with the harsh, hot, and dry climate of Northwest India, create a microclimate, create interactive spaces. Similarly, I would like to talk about Old Delhi because we all are based in Delhi. If you walk through Shahjahanabad, which is the name for Old Delhi, you will feel a sense of rhythm. And every gully, or gully is the Hindi word for lane, or every chalk, which is a Hindi word for square, is full of energy. There is a pulse there, there is a purpose. And I personally feel very safe walking around in this area, even around midnight, because this is a place, these cities, these old cities have achieved, what Jane Jacobs said later very aptly, and Manisha also mentioned, as eyes on the street. You name any old settlement, the poles of Ahmedabad, the mohallas of Bhopal, you can see people walking around, sitting and chatting on little platforms called utlas right outside their houses. And community facilities, commerce, and residents are all proximate. This creates a safe and vibrant environment, and therefore we enjoy these places. However, as the streets and squares become larger, they accommodate larger activities like festivals, ceremonies, public gatherings. And there's a sense of belongingness. People know each other. So, uh, just to say that these cities seem like complete ecosystems where everything is within walking distance, everything is connected. However, we sort of miss it now. And Manisha talked about the colonial bungalow typology, but there are many colonial settlements and towns in India, like the French Pondicherry, Portuguese Goa, Shimla, or parts of Mumbai, Delhi, and Kolkata built by the British. They are beautiful settlements. They have character. Whether it was to channelize the sea breeze, protect against the heat, or get the best view from the mountaintop, these settlements were built for the context. And they were all about the context. So they had these colonnaded streets, standardized building heights, public squares. FBC's form based codes did exist in some form at that time also. And that is what lent these cities distinct character and image, which still is there. So you use the word timeless, and I agree with it completely. And just to conclude, what I feel like saying is that it's the distinct image that I'm talking about is what is getting lost, because places are starting to look like each other. And there's this quote we mentioned in our paper that when you go there, there is no there. So if you go to Gurgaon or another place, in India nowadays, which is not an older settlement, they all look similar, gray and glass. So this is what is very important. And we talk about buzzwords like sustainability and inclusivity today, India had the answers all along. The historic cities were low carbon because you were walking everywhere. They were socially inclusive. Of course, we cannot rebuild those old forms. Of course, we've changed. We have the automobile. We really are using vehicles to get from one place to the other. But the principles can remain timeless. Compactness, mixed use, diversity, respect for diversity, permeability, and most of all, human scale are some of the ideas that we can bring back and develop our own grammar of form based urbanism for the diverse contexts in India.
It's great. You painted a picture that I could totally understand. So, places built for people, places that make you feel happy, places built around people's lives, variety, not uniformity. And I love that you brought in Jane Jacobs because as you were describing that, Eyes on the Street, it was exactly the thought I had. And then the other reference book that I thought of was Christopher Anders' A Pattern Language, where he describes places from the large down to the small. It's about those little nooks and crannies, those places where you can stop and take a pause in the shade, where you can stop and talk with a neighbor. There are these places because those are the places that connect people within the cities, are those in-between places. And I think there's a real irony here. India had these principles embedded in its cities centuries ago and then spent decades planning them out of existence by the sounds of it. So that brings us back to something you mentioned earlier, which is form-based codes. And you talked a bit about it being kind of the grammar, and I love that. So for people outside of the building industry to think about this as a language. Can you explain what form-based codes are and how they differ from the volumetric planning systems currently used in India? And perhaps more importantly, what do form-based codes focus on that could really benefit Indian cities?
To put it really simply, form-based codes are exactly what the name suggests, which is that they move beyond the mathematical logic of volumetric coding that Manisha spoke about, and they actually focus on the physical form of the built environment that's getting created. Let's take an example. Uh, when we look at the setbacks that get set out in the present volumetric codes, what they're doing is they are fundamentally setting out the distance that the building would have to maintain from the edge of a plot, primarily for fire services and other kind of functions. FBCs, form-based codes, by contrast, would code actually the building line and how that built edge encloses or relates to different types of streets, public areas, and other contexts that it is coming in contact with. So what is apparent to me very clearly is that what form-based codes are doing is that they're still dealing with the same plot edge, which Manisha, for example, described as an opaque edge, a compound wall, but doing so with a completely different perspective, with a completely different agenda. So it's fundamentally still coding. It's still a regulation that's kind of replacing the earlier one, but it has a very, very different agenda and a perspective to work with. So it's beginning to work with the physicality of form and how it begins to interact with its surrounding context. Now, this, to my mind, is a distinct kind of move away from simply defining the volume or envelope of a building to kind of beginning to think about the character of the building or the relationship that the building establishes with its surrounding environment. In doing so, it can do a number of things. It kind of improves the response of built environments to the larger context. Now, that context could be physical. There could be some kind of physical feature that it's responding to. It could be cultural in terms of public interactions, etc., or it could even be ecological. I mean, it could be responding to environmental considerations. So what FBCs can do is that it can significantly improve the response of any development to its context. They can therefore definitely mitigate the unintended consequences that we saw of our present rules in cases like Gurgaon, where you're looking at fenced, gated, opaque kind of developments springing up all over the place. They can definitely, in the long run, create high quality street-based urban environments. What Kanak was harking back to, what we still experience when we go to the older parts of Indian cities. And to my mind, one of the underplayed elements of FBCs, and which I think is a very critical element that they do is that uh, if designed well, FBCs can actually provide a mechanism for optimal mixing of various compatible uses within a single plot, which can make for much richer, vibrant, and compact developments going forward, and which is really the need of the hour for Indian cities. Now, this concept is not new. Definitely, it's something that we have discussed. It's definitely not a new idea, not a new concept. In fact, it's at once very old and also relatively recent because in its new form, it was in some senses rediscovered in the 80s and the 90s by a group of American urban designers who created kind of graphic codes to really regulate the nature and form of suburban private developments in American cities, the so-called suburbia. We often, of course, refer to this movement as the new urbanism, but despite its name, it's actually a return to a very traditional form of thinking about cities, about cities that kind of had the human element, cities that were able to relate people to public spaces, to nature much better than our cities today do. Uh, and this was, of course, kind of taken up and also picked up in Europe, in Australia. You see a number of similar practices coming up in the German planning systems, in UK where there was the urban village movement, in Australia where the Rees Code kind of provided a design guide for residential development. So you're seeing a lot of kind of idea coming up in a number of planning practices across the world. Uh, Interestingly, these have tended to be very, very detailed regulations governing everything from facade features to building footprints, roof designs, size and design of openings, materials that can be used. And although we are criticizing a lot of what's happening in the Indian development code, many of these developments, if you look at the suburbia, particularly in America, they have also led to even form-based codes have actually led to very monotonous built environments very often. What is, however, interesting from India's point of view when we think about FBCs is the potential for such coding practices to really manipulate built environments as tools for achieving public outcomes like safety, vibrancy, accessibility, sustainability. And if we can kind of do that well, in a sense, like what happened, usher a kind of a new urbanism for us, while truly really rediscovering something that we had in the past and we lost along the way. Um, Let me also kind of speak about a little bit about the benefits that we can pick up, this practice and kind of adapt it to the Indian context. India is happens to be at a very peculiar developmental juncture. Manisha also kind of referred to it a bit, but it's experiencing extremely high growth rates on the one hand. So there's this entire imperative to develop faster, to develop bigger, larger, but at the same time, it's also grappling with questions of equity and ecological vulnerability. Now, this can lead to very schizophrenic kind of developmental approaches. So, on the one hand, you have national policies that are advocating transit-oriented developments, compact developments. So, very, very progressive, ecologically responsive kind of developmental paradigms. While the local determinants of developments, which is the volumetric codes that we've been discussing, remain focused on really maximization of floor space. Now, this presents a kind of a paradox where cities increasingly adopting good practices in principle, but doesn't really have the tools to actually land this on the ground. Like, how do you land principles of compactness, of walkability, of good public space on the ground with the codes that you have, which don't really respond to these paradigms very well? And this is where I think form-based codes, if we can adapt them well to the Indian condition, can provide a fantastic tool or an entry point to begin to unpack some of these larger terminologies, these responses to climate, responses to equity and things like that on the ground. There are 6 big impacts to my mind if we can, for Indian urbanization as it's emerging, if we can adopt them. One is very clearly, and I think we've heard a resonance of that in both Manisha's and Kanak's discussion, is that we'll definitely be looking at much more safer, accessible, and active public realms. We already have a very vibrant public realm, but the physicality of our cities doesn't actually allow for that to flourish here. We're all, so FBCs can actually code for accessibility both within plots, in streets, squares, vending zones. So bringing urban design and the plot level building together to build safer, more accessible places is something it can do. The second is importantly that it can really improve active mobility and last mile connectivity. Again, walking and cycling have a substantial modal share in India, but our urban development is really so gated with very, very large kind of block sizes that you don't really get with shortcuts, walkable features to really enhance this kind of active mobility in the city. And if we can really build on form-based codes to do that, to unpack some of these things, to just take a simple example, just planning shortcuts through a private plot is something that things like form-based coding could actually actively plan into Indian planning systems, and that can really improve active mobility in a big way. The third is really this entire question of socio-cultural sensitivity. Indian cities are a complex weave of class, caste, culture, often expressed through built form. In many of our older cities, you would see that. Our cities are also full of very, very vulnerable heritage assets, precincts, and customized coding can actually help us address some of these special conditions. The fourth big impact, like I also said before, is this entire question of compact mixed use development. The current Indian developmental model favors monofunctional land use planning, like Manisha was also speaking about, but FBCs can actually actively provide tools to manage mixing of compatible uses. FBCs can also manage green-blue infrastructure and elements extremely well. So, prescribing green roofs, landscape elements, how they kind of interface with public areas is something that we can again code through form-based practices. And lastly, I think again a very important element is that form-based codes might allow our built environments to really respond to climatic conditions much better. Indian cities are often, at least as they stand today, are not very energy efficient. Heat island effects through use of air conditioning and so on and so forth. And so coding can also help us building some of the traditional passive cooling practices that we had in our architecture. And maybe we can bring them back through coding practices into some of our building logic that we are going to implement going forward. Having said all of this, lots of things to gain from this. We'll also, however, have to be very mindful of how we implement FBCs in India. Our cities are very old, made up of multiple typologies that differ, greatly in terms of form, density, built to open space relationships, and so on. And a coarse-grained approach to FBCs is really not going to cut it because we may end up actually erasing this diversity and replacing one-size-fits-all volumetric code with an equally inflexible FBC. And that's really not something that we should be doing. Many FBCs across the world use, for example, a transect approach to vary codes from, say, a peripheral area to an urban center. But if you look at an Indian context, I don't know if you've come to Delhi, but I would encourage you to come to Delhi and core. And you would realize that even a single transect, like the center of the city, can have multiple morphologies from very, very small grain settlements to large footprint commercial enclaves. Now, how do you begin to really think about form-based codes in a circumstance like that? So if you look at the paper, what we've really done is that when we begin to talk about the Indian context, we've really advocated a hybrid, a locally driven kind of a coding system. The idea is really to set out basic non-negotiables and good development principles for various typologies or transacts with hyperlocal customized coding for actually thinking through the architecture and the urban design language that smaller clusters need to adopt. So, for example, while walkability may be a universal design principle that form-based codes could adopt, ground cover of within plots could actually differ from one transect to another, depending on whether something is a flooding zone and another area is not. Whereas the architectural controls really could be very, very locally derived through local participation, etc. Similarly, built typologies could be varied from heavily regulated forms in heritage areas to highly flexible codes in new areas with regulation only restricted to build to kind of interact how buildings interact with streets and to ensure high quality public realms. So all in all, if we can adopt FBCs in the Indian context but do it sensitively and do it with the Indian cities in mind, I think we might provide an interesting way in which to unpack the urbanism that's really going to unfold. And like Manisha said, it's a very large kind of urban load that we are looking at in the next 10 years. And I think it's the absolutely correct time to adopt uh, form-based codes in our cities.
Places that are worth living, places that are about responding to equity issues, climate issues, and that we can learn from what we've done in the past. And the idea is to codify this and to do it in a way that's sensitive enough that it's regionally specific. So you can deal with particular issues, almost, if you think about it in a climate context, microclimatically, neighborhood context. So I think it's a larger system that is also adaptable to smaller specific cases, which makes a lot of sense. I visited BDP's Singapore studio a couple of years ago, and I was amazed at how the older parts of the city wove in so beautifully to the newer parts. And I looked a little bit into some of their planning, and the way that it works is it seems to be that the way they think about their urban planning is about regulating the experience of the city. So not just the land use, but what is it doing? And they have some urban design guidelines built in almost to remind what to think about. Because if you think about it, you need to make these things flexible enough that they can respond to the current needs. So right now we have an aging population all around the world. How do we adapt to provide room for that? How do we make places safe for children? Kind of holistic planning. And so many of the things that you're talking about are being discussed in major cities around the world. But I love that piece about making it very specific to the Indian context, where your cities are so much older, for instance, than the ones in North America. And next thing I'd like to do is really paint a picture for our listeners by imagining what a place might look like following this approach. All of this can still feel a bit abstract, kind of codes, regulations, frameworks. So I'd love to make this really tangible. In your paper, you show these renderings of the city as originally developed, and then you visualize that same place following volumetric design codes and form-based design codes. And I found the contrast between the two incredible. There's the picture paints 1,000 words, like they say. And I'm wondering, can you paint a picture for our listeners of the example you used, Sarojini Nagar? How would its redevelopment look different if form-based codes were applied instead of the current volumetric approach?
Thanks, Michelle. Sarojini Nagar is definitely one of our prime examples to demonstrate our approach, and we wanted to try how we land this to what all Nilesh has explained and make sure that it works and convince us that form-based approach is the way to go for India. Before we delve into what we propose, it's important to understand what Sarojini Nagar is or was for Delhiites and what made it special. Sarojini Nagar was built on the edge of Lutyens, Delhi. It was built where post-partition migrants and government officials lived. It was one of the many colonies which were built along the edges of central Delhi to house civil servants. We call them General Pool Residential Accommodation, GPRA. Like Sarojini Nagar, there are 2-3 other GPRAs in the vicinity which have gone under redevelopment and create a very dismal picture similar to what Manisha has been talking. That's what led us to pick up Sarojini Nagar as an example and see what can we do to make form-based codes work here. So Sarojini Nagar was built in 1950s as flats, as sparse housing for civil servants. It was built for around 3,000 houses, a very sparse development of ground plus 2 structures. These settlements were built by the Central Public Works Department, so they were very basic. They were small structures. Some of them had shops at the ground floor and houses above. There were neighborhoods where parks were right in the center. There were children playing on the streets. You had schools around the corner. There was a market, which was the heart of the entire neighborhood. Of all the 3,000 people who lived, that market was not just a heart for the neighborhood in 50s, but it grew into something which was the heart of South Delhi, and even at a regional level, Sarojini Nagar market was known by people. Interestingly, this market became very popular in the 80s and 90s, where it turned into a budget shopper's hub. So a lot of Delhiites reached Sarojini Nagar as a fashion hub on weekends. They would reach there by small public transport systems like our rickshaws that we have, stroll down evergreen trees shaded streets and shop, and then grab a bite, maybe take back their public transport or the new metro which is built around Sarojini Nagar recently. This was the life of Sarojini Nagar till recently when the redevelopment was decided. In around 2020, when this entire colony redevelopment was happening, and we saw two other major GPRA colonies going through drastic transformation. There is a place called Kidwai Nagar, which saw walls of development, walls of houses coming one after the other as stacked blocks, giving you the density, yes, but not giving you the character that Delhi is made of. We also have Nauroji Nagar, which is now getting built in the same vicinity, converted into a World Trade Center with a large office complex. They coming up where there were small houses. So all this was precedent for Sarojini Nagar redevelopment in 2020. Yes, it had to get redeveloped because there was a dire need of more housing. The density of Sarojini Nagar was around 45 dwelling units per hectare. The houses were getting dilapidated. They were not livable conditions. And that had to increase. We understand that. And to meet this growing demand, the redevelopment was phased out. But what came out as plans made us question. The plans which were released were towering blocks clustered highly around the neighborhood market, looking down upon it, and copy-pasted across the entire region, crisscrossed by grids of very wide roads. Some were respecting the trees which were there, most were not. What it did was, it did achieve the density. We did go from 45 units per hectare, so approximately 90 units per hectare. We had new houses, but did it provide the character Sarojini Nagar had? Did people relate to this place as something they went on weekends to shop and relax? Probably not. It was a space where housing complexes stood tall with large compound walls along the edges, where you had to find your way to find where the market is because it was hidden behind these blocks. Sarojini Nagar no more looked like the way it did. And here we're not propagating that things have to look the same as they were. We do have to meet the demands of urbanization and growing population, but we thought it could be done differently with form-based codes. So even when the roads became wider and it started leaving pedestrians behind, the shop frontages went missing, there was something about the quality of living which could be done with form-based codes. We explored this by trying many strategies, what Nilesh just mentioned previously, trying to see how street edges can be done, trying to see how green can be added, how the nooks and crannies can be more informally placed but still planned for the shortcuts to be taken, to see how the green-blue network in the area worked, because there was a water stream flowing very close to this neighborhood, and there was a chance to revitalize it and give it back to the residents. After looking at many things, I can short it down to three major things that we tried to do and achieve a form-based code resolution of this area. The first thing was we tried to distribute density and tried to do varied type of housing. What we understood was that we had to move away from the cookie cutter tower block, which get pasted after every plot, setback, plot, building, setback, plot. We had to get away from that. So we went with the TOD principles, transit-oriented development principles, which meant the metro stations and the surrounding area around it, around 100 to 300 meters, had to have the maximum density. So we built our tall structures right next to the metro stations. These were the blocks where we thought the young civil servants could live. There could be studio apartments for young families, for students, for people who cannot afford probably a bigger house in the area. And that's where the density remained, and we tried to meet the numbers. But as you moved away from the station, we thought we could reduce the density and try different types of housing. Some mimicked the mid-rise housing that Sarojini Nagar had. You had smaller ground plus 2, ground plus 3 blocks, but we tried to place them in a peripheral manner. Say something what you see in Barcelona or Paris. Not saying that's what India should do, but what it did was it got the street back and the street frontages back, which our old cities had. We went with zero setbacks and a peripheral block, so all houses could look into the street, yet have their own courtyard space in the center. And courtyards are integral to Indian design and planning. We need them, and that's what we reintroduced through the peripheral blocks. And as you moved further away from the stations, we brought back the villas and the low-density housing which was there in Sarojini Nagar. The old street patterns were suggested to be retained because there was the idea of permeability and walkability in those streets, which could be continued even in the form-based codes working. So that was number one. Second was about the zero setbacks and active frontages, which I mentioned. We also tried to break these setbacks with passages or nooks and crannies, as mentioned before. So that is where the shortcuts and the crossovers could be planned. So your markets are not hidden behind. They are discoveries as you walk across the neighborhood. You suddenly peep and you're looking into a park and children are playing. You're not blocked by a compound wall or a security guard or a gated compound to see what's happening behind a building. We purposely added these nooks and crannies to break the entire form and allow for permeability and crossovers and movements. Third, what we did was we connected open spaces. There was a central open space of the market, which was celebrated and restored, and viewpoints to that were given. But we created smaller neighborhood spaces which were open for all and not privatized. And that all led to the river edge open space or the canal edge open space, which was already existing. And this was all done through shortcuts and areas which diagonally cut across this entire grid. And you could reach from one corner to the other, walking or cycling through these networks of open spaces and pedestrian pathways. All of these things are not rocket science. We all have talked about this. This is something which is part of our neighborhoods from the beginning and from our medieval times. We just try to bring it back to a very modern neighborhood. And to our surprise, what we realized was we met the densities that the redevelopment plan was having. From 45, they had gone to 90 units per hectare, and our form-based approach were close to 82 units per hectare. The trade-off was probably 8 units per hectare, but the quality of life was beyond measurable. That's how we tried to test this approach, and we hope similar tests could be carried out by the country to set an example.
It's quite stark what originally looked like with all low-rise housing to what was being proposed with volumetric codes, which was very rigid, all the same, not getting any of these qualities. And I look at these beautiful images that you created about what form-based codes might look like, and I can see the canal, the higher buildings, the smaller ones, and that picture you painted of all those green spaces being connected, being able to walk diagonally through there, and returning some of the green-blue infrastructure to the people. I can see that this would be a place with heart. And I hope that you share this vision beyond, because it seems to me that if people could really imagine this sort of idyllic place, they would build that political will to make it happen. And if you could inspire this in an influential city like Delhi, I imagine it could be hugely impactful. It shows that this isn't really about lowering density, or slowing down growth. It's really about changing the outcomes to create these places that are for people. And so, Kana, Delhi has historically set the tone for urban development across India. What role do you see it playing in leading this shift towards form-based code planning?
Well, Delhi has always been known as the lighthouse city for India, as Manisha had also mentioned earlier, where most of the others follow. And not only is it the national capital, it's a major cultural hub, political hub. And in many ways, it does have the power to set the tone for the kind that happen across India. And I have to mention over here that when Radhika was presenting Sarojini Nagar, painting that picture for you all, it is a lost opportunity for Delhi because huge areas have undergone in almost the central part of Delhi. It is an opportunity lost. But even one case, such as a Nagar, if it comes up in Delhi, many cities across India will adopt. And this is also the time to set this precedent. And Delhi is at the right moment, I would say. And there are 3 points I would say to support this. The first is that the government of India has an act called the Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act. This act allows for land to be acquired and developed by any planning agency or service provider, a government planning agency or service provider that acquires it, develops it with basic infrastructure and disposes it off by cutting plots and selling them to developers or private people. Now, the revision in the Act has made this extremely difficult. So now agencies, in order to acquire land, they require to get consent of all landowners. And they have to carry out a social impact assessment, rehouse all displaced people, and there are these regulations for rehousing also that are very strict. And the compensation that they have to pay is nearly 5 times higher than what it was before in the previous act. So any land that will now come under development or renewal of any older built parts of the cities will have to take place through a partnership between private agency and landowners. Now, Sarojini is another example because it was government-owned land. So the government did the redevelopment, but there are places across Delhi that are under private land ownership, and these have to now redevelop in partnership with the government agency. The role of the public authorities, therefore, is in a stage of evolution right now from being developers of land and housing. They have become facilitators or enforcers of any type of development that's going to come up. So they need to provide infrastructure as well as mainly set the rules of the game to ensure planned development. And that's where precisely form-based codes can become a very powerful tool in their kitty, like an instrument for guiding development, which is being undertaken by private agencies to ensure that it contributes to the public outcomes that we've been talking about through this podcast, to ensure walkability, public good, inclusion, accessibility, climate resilience. So we want to achieve all these, and the instrument is there. And now the development agency is no longer developing housing, land, or any kind of development. This is the time to set these codes. The second point is that we are seeing change happen at national level. So the Ministry for Housing and Urban Affairs, for instance, has released several landmark documents that are demonstrating this change of mindset. So from the harmonized guidelines and space standards for universal accessibility to the standards for ease of doing business or ease of living, all of these have been endorsed or formulated by the central ministry. In the past decade, national missions like Smart Cities missions or Hirday, which is a mission that provides funding for cities with valuable built heritage. These are all steps towards area-based regeneration and improvement and provide opportunities to apply context-specific codes. What Nilesh was talking about earlier when he said that we need to have differentiated form-based coding for Indian cities. We also see a lot of focus on nature-based solution, children and elderly-friendly cities. In fact, BDP itself, Manisha, was involved in creating the guidelines for creating infant, toddler, caregiver-friendly neighborhoods for the ministry, which was a huge leap for India. In fact, right now, what is happening is 101 railway stations across India are being redeveloped based on a form-based code that has been endorsed by the ministry and prepared by urban designers. So that's good news. All of these, I would constitute them as good news because it's being realized at national level that quality of life is an important aspect to pay attention to. So form-based planning in that sense can become a bridge between that economic productivity one looks for from a city and everyday livability. And thirdly, and most importantly, what we started with, that is Delhi. Here I would like to say that Nilesh and I had the opportunity to lead the preparation of the draft master plan for Delhi for 2041. Unfortunately, it's still not notified. So none of the things that are mentioned in that are applicable on ground right now. But if it is, it has built a strong foundation for a nationwide adoption of progressive urban design codes. So in the plan, they are called additional development controls. They're not called form-based codes, but this is the name that is used. And 4 development typologies across Delhi have 4 different typologies of codes. So we have the land pooling areas, which are on the periphery of Delhi for greenfield development. The green development zones, again on the periphery, but for very low density development and preserving ecology, creating forested areas. The regeneration areas, which is places like Sarojini Nagar or heritage zones, and transit-oriented development zones, like how Radhika mentioned, that near a metro station, you can have intense, dense, mixed-use, high-quality environments. So these 4 kinds of typologies of codes, I would say, are already there in the plan. And they allow for this area and context-based customization of codes. I would like to end by saying that the scale of the impact, if we get this right, is extraordinary. Manisha mentioned before that India is urbanizing faster than almost any country, or like 2 or 3 countries maybe there are that are rapidly urbanizing as India. And in the next 2 decades, hundreds of millions of people will be added to our cities. So that's why Delhi's leadership really, really, really matters, because it isn't just about aesthetics with these codes. It's also about all these global agendas that India has ratified to. It has signed up for climate resilience, economic vitality, social equity. So if Delhi can take this leap and this draft plan is notified, it won't just shape its own destiny, but it would light the way for other cities and redefine what Indian cities of today could look like. Thank you.
Painting the picture of Delhi as the lighthouse. Where it leads, others will follow. And I have to say, there's a part of me that feels optimistic, given that you and Nilesh were a part of the master planning for the 2040 vision for the city. Especially just the way that you talk about it, and the way that it seems to have changed, the way the government's role within city planning has changed. They've moved from being the developers to the protectors of the public realm, the ones that really need to have this vision for this to happen. So we've talked about history, we've talked about codes, design, governance, but ultimately cities are shaped by people, by decisions, priorities, and political will. I'd like to wrap this up going around the table, and I want you to try to keep it to one minute each. And I know that can be really quite challenging. But my question to you is, if there's one change you would urge policymakers, planners, or citizens to support today, what would that be? And Radhika, maybe we could start with you.
Thanks, Michelle. Thank you for asking that. What I would like to see is one lighthouse project, not a city, but a small test, some good design examples applied, some policies landed on ground, and demonstrated to the government and to the users of how it will work. It has to be a test. It is not something which will happen easily, but we need some risk-taking developers, some ambitious officers to give a green light to a development like this, because only when people experience this change will they start to notice the difference between the quality of life and experience we are trying to develop. Currently, all of this is being looked at with a lens of quantification and being rejected, being too rosy and too qualitative and unmeasurable. But the moment you start seeing an experience, the users will start demanding it, and that demand will lead to a supply, and the cycle will follow.
If you build it, they will come. And I also think your numbers prove that you got very close to the density that they were after. I'd like to move on to Nilesh.
I think the most important thing that we can do, and I think it would be a great service to all of what we spoke about today, is if we can empower communities and planners at the local level. Indian planning systems often end at city government, city scale. We have pretty large development corporations. We have city planning units, but they don't really trickle down to the local district level. Now, I think that's something that's very, very critical if we want to get form-based codes right. And why I say this is because I spoke about this earlier as well. I think it's important that we are able to localize form-based codes at the neighborhood level and really kind of come up with solutions that work for communities. I mean, where communities can actually engage with some of these ideas. And for that to happen, I think we would have to create structures that are able to support planning structures that are able to support that thinking. So I think it's important that we do that. And just one additional element that I would really want to talk about is that the builder lobby, the construction industry in India is a very powerful industry. And you spoke about political will, and one way of really significantly tilting political will in favor of progressive codes like this is if we can get that lobby on board. And that's going to happen it's going to take a lot of effort to really sensitize them and a lot of creative thinking to think about what is the value in this change for them, how do we present that value to them, and how do we really craft policies that are able to actually actualize that value for them on the ground. That's when we will see many of these guys supporting this kind of a change. And that's really to my mind, the inflection point when they come on board.
Yeah, I hear the builder lobbies are often extremely strong. And with all of this, I think it's speaking about these issues in a way that people can understand. And Radhika talked about building it so people would understand it. And I love that you have brought community engagement into it because it's such a key part is to get the people on board, because if they believe, they're going to support it and help move the agenda along. Love to move to Kanak. What's your take on this?
Yes, Michelle. I think I would like to echo what Nilesh is saying about people participating in the process of design and planning, especially for their local areas. Because even participation that's happening in planning in India right now, as Nilesh said, is at city level where it all becomes a homogenized group of people, citizens of the city. And you're not really getting those responses, like the disaggregated responses from the different users of the city. Like there are women, children, elderly, and people with disability. As users of the city, what are those things that they require to navigate their local areas or neighborhoods? So there are two things. Many people in Delhi, if you lived in Delhi, you would hear many people say that, we are in Delhi for some economic opportunity. We've come to make a living here. And they keep talking about home, which is some other little town or village somewhere. And same is true for many cities, big cities in India. So the ownership or the belongingness is missing. That's because the only focus is to get out of your homes and get out in the city and go to work. So I think the spaces and the disaggregated participation is what I would like to emphasize on, because when a small child, a girl child, goes out to just enjoy the street rather than out of necessity to go to school, is when we would have achieved.
I love that vision of a small being able to navigate their rules, and it brought me back to that idea of bringing the heart back to the city and really people to call the cities home, to feel that sense of belonging. it's about hearing a variety of voices. Who are those users? What do they need so that they can make the city home? And finally, Manisha, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yes, thanks, Michelle. I think if I had to sum it up, I'd say that we have to move from one of the biggest. Sorry. Form-based code is not a magic template we can copy-paste. So it is a framework that has to be interpreted and it has to be done intelligently. As Nilesh spoke about, in a localized form at the neighborhood level, taking people into account, as Kanak mentioned. And this requires a different kind of planning system than the one we currently have. We need to focus on capacity building, the ability to translate codes, local codes, so that a large percent of applications can be assessed objectively. And we need to invest in design competence, people who can understand urban form, not just check, because we've seen how indiscriminate, standardized developments we have when we are using volumetric codes that have no local context. We didn't talk about climate. We have the same codes in Delhi as we do in Himachal Pradesh or near the Himalayas, which is why the whole local idea, the whole capacity building at a local level is important for the planning system to make this a success. Thank you.
Yeah, capacity building is huge, especially at the scale that you're talking about. And I think this idea of sharing of decentralizing where things are happening, needing those people that are doing those reviews so that they can be objective and that it's about building that design competence. I love that. And so here we have design reviews. We do that internally at BDP, but we also do it here at the city scale. And I think that's such an important part. What exactly are we looking for? And it's not just design numbers, but we're also talking about that subjective, qualitative design review and that kind of professional eye. So I'll just wrap it up from here. As cities around the world face the pressures of rapid urbanization, the opportunity to rewrite the rules and create vibrant, sustainable, and inclusive spaces has never been greater. Together, we can shape cities that honor their heritage for the people who call them home. Thank you to my esteemed panelists for taking the time to explore this issue with me. I truly believe that you have inspired the action we need to create a good city. And honestly, I am feeling relieved that the group of you have such an influence in the work that you do. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. If you'd like to explore more about Delhi's approach to planning, check out the Delhi paper and find out more about the Good City Initiative at www.bdp.com.